don't all the best laid plans go wrong? This is what happens when Alex isn't in charge. Hopefully you'll rejoin us. We're here, as you may have seen if you were here a few seconds ago when everything sort of didn't work so well. I'm here with Dr. Erin Farley of Dundee Central Library to talk about our wonderful new records from Dundee and Angus. And also we're going to have a big chat about local history and social history and why it's really, really important for family history. Hi again, Donna. Sorry that you lost us for a little bit.
It's really exciting to be here.
It's really good, yeah. Hi, Vedat. I hope I've got your name right. And hi, Linda, as well. It's exciting. Hi, Diane. So we're going to have a big conversation. We've got up until the top of the hour, so we're going to fill as much as we can with lots of wonderful facts.
Yeah.
And yes, so should we start with the new records?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of them, isn't there?
Oh, there's over 6 million, and it's fantastic. Dundee is a really, really fantastically influential city in Scottish history. It's the 4th largest at the moment, but it has been larger in the past, and it's got a rich industrial heritage, which I'm sure Erin will enlighten us on a little more shortly. But yes, what kind of records do we have in this big collection?
Well, we've got a lot of the old parish register, baptism, marriage and death records from all across Dundee and Angus. So that's a lot of parishes, a lot of ancestors. A lot of my ancestors are in there, so I'm looking forward to trying to dig a few more of them out.
That's good.
And we've also got valuation rolls as well for the County of Angus, and I find them really fascinating just to browse through, as well as sort of searching by name, because they're amazing sort of histories of a place. They tell you who is the landowner in a place, who owns buildings, and also who's renting the buildings, the main tenants. But they're great to kind of look through and see places develop. Some places get much more populated, some places much less populated.
And these are really useful for in between census years. If you'd want to know when someone was in a property, when they moved along, you can use valuation rolls to work out when they might have changed ownership. So it's sometimes good to look for a street and look for a building, because then you can see who's inside it. And if it's a relative, then you know you're in the same place. If it's a totally new name,
absolutely,
you might need to look elsewhere.
Yeah. And we've also, talking about things that are good for in between census years, we've also got electoral registers as well. So there are loads of sort of names on these. And obviously they kind of you get more and more names as you go through time. So we've got them up until 1938. And as you see the reform bills come in, you see the books get thicker and thicker, and you get more and more names coming up on them. But I have found as well, it's not totally all men, even in the early years before women get the full right to parliamentary votes. You do find women registered for local elections, because if they owned property, they could in some cases qualify. So you might be surprised who pops up on the early valuation rolls. I mean, the electoral registers as well as the later ones.
It's fantastic. And we've got a wonderful... we've launched a lot of obituaries as well.
Yeah, I love the obituaries, partly because the obituary collection is something that librarians in Dundee have been sort of cutting out of the local papers and compiling since 1869. And we still do that today as well. My colleagues are going through the papers as we speak, looking for sort of notable death notices. So it's really, really exciting for us to see that up on the internet, because up until sort of this week, you've had to use a card catalogue to go through people by name to find them. So
we've already seen, there's Anya in the comments saying she's already found a page with obituaries in Dundee with one of her cousins and her partner's 2 times great-grandmother, about 3 entries before on the same page.
Oh, wow.
So it's already seeing success.
Oh, that's really exciting. I love seeing people discovering these records already.
Do tell us if you have any more successes, and we'd love to hear more about that. We see Alex Cox is on the other side of the camera this time in the comments. He's helping out.
Hello, Alex.
It's I think he's on the bus on the way towards the airport. He was here in Dundee as we launched our records last night. It was his first time in Dundee, and I think he's fallen in love with the city, and it's a wonderful thing to see, because Dundee is a fantastic place, and now we can portray so much more of it. And the reason why we can, which is really exciting, as well as the valuation rolls, electoral registers, parish registers, and the wonderful obituaries, is we have photographs online for the very first time. How exciting is that? Our photographic collection is wonderful, and it's brand new. Comes from a number of places, the University of St Andrews Library, and also from Leisure and Culture Dundee, from Erin's lovely collection. And how great is that we can then use that for family history?
It's so cool. And what I love as well is matching up the different photographic collections, because the photographs we've contributed, they are mostly taken in the late 19th century, early 20th century. These are photographs taken by Alexander Wilson, who was a supervisor in one of the jute mills, and he kind of got a camera when cameras started becoming more accessible to the public, and just devoted all of his spare time to photographing every sort of street and building in Dundee that he could find. But there's also a lot of ones from kind of mid-19th century that have come from the St Andrews collections. So it's amazing being able to slot them together and like look at how a street changes over the decades.
That's fantastic. It's as you look at these photographs, if you go and take a look in the Record A to Z or anything, look for our Dundee and Angus photographic collection. There are names to search for, and there are named individuals, but if you ignore the names for now and just start typing in street names of where your ancestors are from in the area, or even towns and villages, you'll see all of the records we have, all these different images for different places. One particular place, which is just to the left of us actually, the Howth Cemetery, which is a brilliant place to look at. If you're ever in Dundee, it's such a majestic kind of place. And if you look for that, so Howth, Howff, then just use that as a keyword. You'll be able to see all of these wonderful Victorian photographs of some of these stones that have now worn away and can't be recognised. You can see some wonderful views of this very sort of Gothic looking cemetery. It's great to see. And streets as well. Many streets, take it from a census and just type the street name in. You'll see a list, and then you can order it by year, and you can see how a street has changed over perhaps almost a century.
Yeah, even streets that no longer exist in Dundee, because this is a city that's seen a lot of waves of regeneration and rebuilding over the years, which is why I think it's a particularly great city to be starting off a kind of historic photographic collection like this in. And yeah, it's hopefully possibly something we might see for other places as well in the future, do you think?
I think so. We'll have to watch this space. We just had a note from Karina, who says, as Norwegian, I like your accent. I don't know whose accent. I assume Erin's, because mine's not as exciting. But thank you.
Like, I don't have an accent. You're the one with the accent.
That too. Yes. So we're seeing everyone else commenting about this great thing. I said Alex is being very helpful, slacking off, someone has said, and Tessa said that our camera keeps vibrating. We have a camera that, again, I'm not very technical. I can do records, but technology not so. So the camera is looking at us and isn't working. So we have another camera on, and that's unfortunately attached to the laptop. So it is making a bit of a wobble, but we'll try and stay still and not do too much. Yes.
Okay,
and,
so that's the dance routine off the books then.
But speak for yourself. We're still excited for the closing number. The pyrotechnics are booked. We're having that. The Howth is very cool. Anya says, one of my partner's relatives is buried in there. Not a blood relative, the first wife of one of his great something or another grandfathers. And that's quite cool.
The Howth is fantastic. And it was quite well known at one point for its sort of unusual epitaphs and the sort of wee rhymes that people would write on the gravestones. And sadly, a lot of them, like you said, have kind of worn away now. So there's a lot of things that you wonder, we're taking the Victorians' word for the fact that this was on a gravestone, but they might be just making things up for their own amusement as well.
Yes. Well, I think you found quite a wonderful poem that really fits from historic. It's a Dundee newspaper, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is a poem that's from a magazine called The Piper o' Dundee, And this was actually, maybe the best way to describe it is if you know the satirical magazine Private Eye, it was like a Dundee specific Private Eye. So they had cartoons and sort of sarcastic takes on the Dundee news. But there was a poem published there in 1895. It's called Selected Ancestors. And for quite a long time, we actually had this on the wall in the family history corner in the library because it seemed so appropriate. So I'll maybe share this with you now.
Go ahead.
It's all the rage to now engage in many odd researches for what is told in records old, in safety vaults and churches. We aim to know if, long ago, our forebears honours carried, and if they came in time to fame, and whom the maids they married. We search to see if we may be from kings or knaves descended, and learn forsooth the simple truth that both in us are blended. We find it's true, there's blood that's blue, that in our veins is flowing, and then we find some other kind, o'er which we do no crowing. It's very sad, but through this fad, it seems that we are fated to learn of knaves who're in their graves, to whom we are related. 'Twould be more fun for everyone if blood could be selected, and forebears bad we may have had could calmly be rejected.
I like that, but I quite like a black sheep.
Yeah,
I think that's exciting enough.
Absolutely, you need a story.
Yes.
It's all, if everyone's too well behaved, then just, you need a wee bit of intrigue, don't you?
Yes, we've got some people from nearby when we released our Fife calendar of convicts in our national sort of Scottish criminal record collection, and there are some fantastic stories in there of, angry clowns and wizard spell casting, everything else. So there are some wonderful stories that are worth looking at. And speaking of great stories, we found some good characters in these great records too. Everyone has a story, and it's fantastic to look at these wonderful family stories. But there are some particular people who may not be so well known, as well as the famous ones, that really show you how great it is to illustrate family history with this collection of great records. There's the most famous, I guess, or at least the most well heard of would be William McGonagall, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he is, I think, for better or worse, maybe Dundee's most famous son, even though he was technically not born in Dundee. He was born in Edinburgh to an Irish family. And the records of his early years are a little bit woolly. I think it's quite hard to track down exactly where he was spending his early life. But by the time you get to Dundee, you do see him coming up in things like the censuses and other sort of historical records. So we know the addresses that he used to live in. We can see his children as well, sort of going about their lives, and some of them got up to some interesting things as well. He's also a very frequent flyer in the Dundee newspapers of the time, which are a fantastic source for local history. I honestly think Dundee is really, really blessed with its newspaper history.
Yes. So I know we've talked about these wonderful Dundee records, and they're fantastic. And even if you have no ancestors from Dundee and Angus, take a look at those wonderful photographs. Look, browse, explore, look by year, see some of the really early versions, some of the later ones, and just see how streets have changed. There are some beautiful, beautiful images, and they're so detailed.
Yeah.
I think we've lost a little bit of that. And that kind of brings us on to our sort of larger, grander topic today, which I think more of you can contribute to. I think for those of you who haven't got ancestors from Dundee and Angus, is local history and social history is really, really useful to filling in these gaps. And I think, with having an expert here, it seems like the best chance to find out more about adding a bit of meat on the bones and telling more stories. So we're looking out for all of your comments and things. So I see, Cheryl, you were saying this is just Scottish history, but no. There's said local history covers everywhere. The same rules apply, no matter where you are. If you're in Australia, Canada, England, Wales, obviously the weather's different, but the rules are the same.
Yeah, and it's also, I think when people sometimes first hear local history, they assume it is going to keep you to one place. But the thing is, people have always moved about, and often folk in the library are quite surprised to find out just how much their ancestors actually moved around, even in the sort of 19th or 18th centuries.
It's in the 1700s, about half of the people in England and Wales didn't die in the parish they were born. That's one of my favourite facts I kind of throw in. People moved, and they tended to move sometimes for harvesting. If they're agricultural labourers, they'd move to different places, sometimes in the spring, which if you're an avid genealogist, you know is about when censuses are taken, so that might make things a little more difficult. And then also they tended to stay within a sort of 20-mile radius until the Industrial Revolution, when railways sort of changed the game a little bit. So don't discount those parishes further away. And Findmypast has this really cool feature where you can search by distance to a place as well. So you can pick up those different parishes rather than perhaps in other websites where you have to look for in the county or not. Our ancestors didn't really, unless they were from, say, Yorkshire and Lancashire, they wouldn't maybe cross the line. But
because Yorkshire is so huge, you can do a lot of travelling.
Everything else, they never saw the lines on a map. They went to what was close. They would go to churches that were nearby. Sometimes I found they go to further away churches just because it was an easier walk and they wouldn't go up the hill.
And also, certainly in Scotland, you find there's all these different denominations of the church, and people are willing to travel quite far to attend a church that is in their own denomination rather than just what happens to be the closest one. Definitely,
that's it as well. I think sometimes we have this idea, possibly because of history and maybe even the modern day, that people stayed of the same faith their whole life, but there was a lot of conversion between different religions, and sometimes you'll find someone starting as one faith and another, or going to the church of a different faith just because it was closer.
Absolutely. I do think there's a bit of that. I know my own ancestors came from County Cavan in Ireland to Dundee in the mid-19th century, and they were Catholic when they came over, but pretty quickly seemed to just start going to the local Protestant churches for easiness' sake. So
one of the exciting records we've got Quaker records from Ireland. And the great thing about a Quaker wedding is that everyone who attends the wedding witnesses the wedding. So all of these records, if you go and have a look at these records, look at a Quaker marriage record now on Findmypast Irish collection, you'll see every single name of everyone who attended that wedding indexed.
That is so cool. You've got the whole wedding party list there.
And they're not just Quakers, they're the neighbours, they're the friends, the relatives.
And that's just such an amazing way to see a picture of everyone that's coming together as a community and get a sense of who was all spending time together, and just imagining the conversations they might have been having.
I know, it is fantastic. There are, one of the big things when we talk about local and social history is always maps. Maps are very, very exciting.
Yes, maps are brilliant, especially when you are trying to get a sense of what is in an area. And one of the things that we have in the live today, unfortunately not available online currently, but I love being able to get them out and show people, is we've got some old insurance plans of central Dundee. So they go into great detail not only about what businesses are resident in which buildings, but they tell you like literally what the roof was made out of and things like that.
So those exist as well for other places. I know that there's some for London. I've seen some people do some work on those. I think they're in the Guildhall, I believe. I'm not sure. I might be wrong there, but those kind of maps are really exciting. And there's one resource that I can recommend that doesn't just cover Scotland. It sounds like it does, but no. I think it's the National Library of Scotland Maps collection. It's free.
Fantastic, and it is completely free to use online. And as you say, it goes beyond Scotland and what it's got.
Yes, all of Britain, England, Wales, and everywhere else, all of the islands too. It's really exciting to see period maps, because things change quite a lot. When you see street names change, anything like that, when you're looking for Watkins Street and you can't find it anywhere in a modern map, maybe it's now been renamed as something else.
That's or sort of in Dundee, again, for a local example, some of our old streets are now shopping centres. So figuring out kind of where they, what used to be below this street, and we've had folk in the library, I'm kind of like, yes, your grandfather lived sort of right below us. Sorry, you can't go and see the house.
I've done that myself. I've gone to see an ancestor's house and got really excited. I was going to go and visit. I think it was while I was somewhere in Cornwall, and then found a car park exactly where they lived. So, you know, it can happen. Always check. A really exciting way to do, especially say if you are in somewhere like Australia or Canada and you can't get to somewhere in Britain where you want to see things, or if you want to find your ancestors that traveled abroad and you want to see somewhere in America or Australia, you can use Google Maps, and there's a little pin you can take from the side, and you can use the street view, and you can see the streets as they are now, and you can almost do a virtual walking tour and go to these places.
And sometimes, you know, you'll even get a cat or something captured on the street view.
I don't know if it's your ancestor's cat, but it's great to see some life.
Time traveling cats on Google.
We have a lot of cats and dogs in records, so it's exciting.
Yes.
That's another episode of Friday's Live that I think we have to do. Animals in records, what kind of great pets our ancestors had.
Pets and sort of working animals, and like, for example, the horse is a huge part of rural heritage across the UK. There's lots of fish, there's lots of whales as well that come up in history around here. So yeah, that's definitely at least a whole episode to itself.
So, and one of the really cool things that we sort of forget is if your ancestors were agricultural labourers or something like that, and they probably couldn't read and write, the government really only interfered when there was money involved, or if someone had to be sort of enumerated for another reason. So a lot of their traditions and culture and history is oral. It's preserved from people talking to their children, passing on little stories and tales. And there's a huge wealth of information in folk history and sort of local traditions that might be able to tell you more about how your ancestors lived and how they did their daily life.
Yes, and there's a lot of sort of local libraries and archives will have collections of this as well, whether they've got sort of oral history recordings that you can yourself go and listen to, or sort of folklore books and archive material. But yeah, sometimes the little stories that give you a real sense of what life was like. I remember one of the stories that I always used to hear about my own family in Dundee. It was sort of my dad's mum was one of about sort of 12 children who were a sort of a very jute mill working family, and they would all sort of basically sleep in one room. And it was my dad's mum, my granny, who one night she heard her dad saying, "Get up and turn the well off." And the well was what the old word for a tap was in Dundee. And she was sort of half asleep and saying, "Oh, but I did turn it off." And eventually, after him going on at her for a while, she eventually dragged herself out of bed and through to the kitchen. And sure enough, the tap was on. And then she stumbled back to bed and lay down. And then she remembered her dad had been dead for about 5 years at this point.
Wow, okay.
And so it's just such a everyday ghost story. Like, we're not wasting water in this household.
I think records of ghost encounters aren't online yet, but they could provide some interesting things. I mean, one question I think to everyone out there is, what would you ask your ghostly ancestors if you had an encounter with them? I'm sure there are many questions you could ask.
Be like, stay there, I've got a list.
I have a notepad, and there's a wonderful book that I've encountered relatively recently from a friend of mine. They're called the Child Ballads. They're really, really exciting. There's about 200 of them. There's 2 different versions. You'll find it online for free. Usually there's a few places that have it. And it's a list of all of these wonderful songs that were sung by rural British folk from all over, from sort of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And the way they approach different things really give you an idea as to how they felt about different sort of things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were collected by a man called Child. The first thing they teach you in folklore school, child ballads are not necessarily about children. There's all sorts of murder and love stories. But they really do they tell you, although they're sort of supernatural and fantastical, they really get to the core of human experience.
I think, I mean, it's great to add that little bit of extra detail and just to try and see things through your ancestors' eyes. Margaret Grant said that she would ask her great-grandfather, "Who are your parents?" And I think in the same field, when we're always looking backwards, sometimes it's important to look forwards. And this is one of my big sort of passionate moments. I get really excited by this. And I say to everyone, sit down. Now you can have an audio recorder on your phone. You can download them for nothing. There's different ways you can do this. But record details of your own life. Talk about your parents, even the simple things like, what you used to play with as a child, the games you played, the streets that you lived on, and just record it in your own voice, in your own words, and attach it to your family tree, put it somewhere safe. And then imagine what could happen in 100 years, 150 years, people hearing your voice describing your life in your youth. And every day there are so many stories that sort of disappear when, someone's no longer with us. And imagine the wonderful stories that we've lost.
Yeah, and just the joy of your ancestors a few generations down the line coming across that.
Great. It's kind of our charitable act. It's do something for your descendants, because we're always looking for our ancestors and we're wishing they did the same. But now we have a bit of opportunity to do that. It would be so exciting. It's great. And, accents are changing. There's some things.
One of the questions, though, is format. What format do we save things in digitally that's still going to be available in a few generations' time? This is one of the things that keeps me awake at night, because I have no answer. But if I find one, I'll let you know.
That will be a big thing, I guess. But I think it's wonderful. I sat down with my grandmother and we talked all kinds of wonderful stories. And it's great to hear her. She talked about her own grandmother, someone who died many decades ago, almost a century ago, and I can hear her describe her youth. So I'm hearing stories of the mid 1800s in the tale of someone who heard it from someone who was there, and everyone has the opportunity, I think, to add to this wonderful wealth of knowledge. And we talk about local history and social history and our own ancestors, and we can contribute in that way. So that's a really big important thing too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as well as maps, as well as sort of records tying things together, newspapers are a great thing to understand what was going on in town. They're fantastic.
They really are. I love a newspaper story. And in Dundee, certainly, which is the history that I know best, so I am keeping coming up with Dundee examples here, I'm afraid. But some of the newspapers got really involved in local stuff themselves, as well as just reporting on it. There's actually a really interesting time in the 1870s where you've got Dundee, who's the lord of some of the lands which are in Dundee. And he was wanting to turn some of his land into a quarry. But the problem was this was the law. So anyone who knows Dundee knows that this is a really important landmark and also a really important public space for the people of Dundee. And some of the photos in the collections show how important it would have been in the 19th century to have a green space, because looking down from the law, it's a sea of chimneys and there's smoke everywhere. So Dundee was building walls around the law, and he was trying to start quarrying on it. And Dundee was having none of this. So there was a meeting set up to form the Dundee Right of Way Association. And this actually took place. John Lang, who was a big newspaper editor in Dundee at the time, was really involved in this movement. And he sort of encouraged people to kind of sneak up at night and knock Dundee's walls down. And then they ran an editorial in the People's Journal, which was one of his newspapers. And they said, well, it's no wonder that the walls keep crashing down, because he's trying to build a quarry on an extinct volcano and only an idiot would do that. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but it's just, you have to kind of look at the context some of the times and the other sources for what's going on.
I love the idea that we might wear different clothes and have different hairstyles, but we are essentially, genetically especially, identical to all of our ancestors. We have the same needs, wants, desires, and if you think things in that sort of way, we kind of forget when we see those old photographs and they look so distant, and it's hard to sort of apply that, but we think, what would we have done in these situations? And in newspapers, the same things that you read about in the newspaper today are the same sort of things people were complaining about and singing the praises of back in the 17 and 1800s. I know we're in the middle of an election campaign here in Britain, and that's one of those contentious issues that will run and run and run. But I've been looking at old election coverage, and everything's the same. Everyone's been shouting at each other for so long, and they've been doing exactly the same things. There are tales in an election in the 1880s of people using this crazy new invention called a loudhailer, where they would just make this cone and they would shout down anyone who was saying things they disagreed with.
Yeah.
They would run after them with paintbrushes and they would paint their faces. They would stamp down their top hats as they went through. They would riot while people were doing polling and having any kind of debate. And every once in a while, they just run the person out of town completely. So you think that we live in sort of rougher, more dangerous times, but we are exactly the same.
It seems like it's always been quite a dangerous profession, being a politician in the public eye.
That's again another whole episode to talk about that, but possibly maybe after an election's taken place. We don't want to get involved in that too much. But just that idea said there are everything you can think of in the newspapers. I've found, monkey duels, balloon abductions, the strange, the weird, the wonderful, the great, the good. And it's amazing when you look at things like marriages and you can see the gifts that are given to people on their wedding, and photographs too.
And the letters pages as well. You never know who's going to crop up on a letters page. Sadly, a lot of times people do write in anonymously, so it's hard to tell if it is somebody that you know or not, but a lot of people do use their real names as well. And seeing people's opinions on things. One of my favourite ever letters to a Victorian newspaper was a man who wrote into the Dundee Advertiser, and he just opened with, "Sir, I am a ghost," and he went on to describe his life in a churchyard. And the point was that people are letting their sheep graze on his churchyard, and it's terrible, and he can't get a nice, peaceful afterlife.
Wow.
But just that set up as a way of complaining about council policies is just astounding.
We've got a comment from Jenny Lloyd there. "My granddad's name was Lloyd and my nana's name was Stuart. Can you tell me more? A relation told me we were descended from Bonnie Prince Charlie. Not sure if it's true." The only way to really tell is to start with yourself and work backwards. Having the same surname as someone, it's risky to say that you're of the same family because surnames can arrive in so many different ways. If your name is Archer, for example, maybe it's an occupational surname, and so you just, from the time that your surname stuck, you just happen to have that profession. It's very difficult to then apply and say you're all the same. If you look at everyone called Smith, they're all not related. They've all come from that same occupational. Some people are named after the locations that they were in at the time. There are many different names that relate to towns and places. And then there are other things. Sometimes they're named after things like physical characteristics. There are names like Jenkin, which means sort of small John, and things. And there's also in Wales, they use a patronymic system, and they had sometimes, up until surnames were sort of forced upon them by the English, they had up to 9 generations in their surname, and they would just keep adding on. And what they did when they were told, now it's time you have to have a surname, they just lopped off the other 8 and kept the first one. So whoever Jones will be the son of John at the time, and others in the same way.
I actually have a question for you.
Okay.
Just about the surnames based on place. So when people are named after a place, is that when they've come from there and then live somewhere else and they're known as like, John from Edinburgh, or are they known by the place when they live in the place?
It depends where. So before we had surnames, they were just ways to denote someone in an area. So we've got a wonderful collection, I remember, of York sort of trade and guild records, and you have people from little villages outside of York, and they'd be called sort of Hugh de something, and it would be the village they came from. So that way in York you'd know who they are. But it does vary, and it also depends how large the area is, because if everyone was called Hugh York, then it would be very hard to find
everyone's name.
Exactly. Yes. So there's also names, these physical characteristics. I know as I do quite a bit of Sicilian research, my own family and things. In Sicily, it was illegal to change your surname from the 1500s because it was how they kept taxing you. They wanted to make sure they could find you again. They have these wonderful census records going back to the 1500s, and they even have drawings of some of the people, the farmers, so they could find them and tax them.
So you know who to go after.
Yes, some of their surnames, they're not always very flattering. So there are some ancestors. I have a family name called Occhipinti, which means small eyes. And Mario Puzo, the man who wrote The Godfather and other books, Puzo means smell. So, it's a strange thing to know that your ancestors were perhaps not as fond of a bath as others. And these things can really stick. So
it's like a less flattering version of the Vikings calling themselves like Magnus Barelegs and things like that.
That's it. There's so many different ways. We're going to take another look at some of the comments. Cindy Pennington is saying her main problem is being able to play old cassettes and somehow getting it into more modern formats. There are things you can buy that you can convert things into digital from things like cassettes, and they're really useful. It's kind of good to keep on top.
Things like that are thankfully getting more affordable. They're still, you know, some of them are still a considerable outlay, but there are also sort of people who will do it for you as well. Hopefully there will be one in your local area where you can sort of say, come along with your cassettes and get them put onto MP3 format or something.
That's great. And Patricia said she did exactly that. She had some old tapes that her late husband did for her when they were courting, and they found someone who copied them onto CD. How great is that? Tapes are coming back, so you may get a player. I have a tape player as well.
I'm quite glad to hear tapes are coming back. That'll.
The one thing to remember with tapes, though, is tapes are a media that degrades. So every time you play them, they wear out a tiny bit. So you might have one of those cassettes, if you remember when you were young, and you play it over and over until it sounds very, very weird. That would be the same with these voices and things like that. So it would be useful to put them into another format as well, just to make sure that you don't lose that wonderful thing in there. The same with things like photographs, microfilm. Every time microfilm is used, it wears away a tiny bit. This is why it's so important to put them in other formats and into digital format, which is what we've done with all these wonderful records.
And then when we've got the digital format, we figure out a way to preserve that.
Yes. And that's one of those things. Denise says, my daughter bought my husband a little gadget that plays your cassettes and transfers them to PC via USB. If you search online, you might find something similar. That's exactly what we're going for.
Something like that would be a great thing in any sort of researcher's toolkit if you've got a lot of media formats.
It's fantastic. And yes, it's great. And we kind of forget now, we're kind of sport for choice, that there's so much stuff online, it's so digital. And there are so many things that are still paper, still in archives, still in libraries. And sometimes you really have to go old-fashioned, and you have to get there and get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves, and start to look through these records.
I mean, the stuff's not that dirty, we hope. There are some things, some things you do go and just, a lot of dust. But we do our absolute best to keep them nice and clean for folk.
It is wonderful. I mean, Margaret Grant's saying she loves the old fiche, and it is quite nice to get out there. And even if you've never used paper documents and you've always worked online and research, I recommend going to your local library or archive and just trying to do some research the old-fashioned way, if only to appreciate the difference and to understand that records coming online all the time. We release new records every week. That's brilliant. But there are still so many records that will take many years to complete and to digitize and to have everything there. And so it's really interesting. You can find lots of things that you really don't realize exist when you go to a local library, local archive, and start looking for yourself.
Yeah, and I'm hugely biased towards getting people to come into their local library and archive. But this is also a good place to find these sort of lesser known books about local folklore, traditions and history that would hopefully flesh out the story of your ancestors a bit and give you an idea of what life might have been like for them.
And Angela Hitchcock, going back to our conversation about surnames, I have an ancestor with a surname Paternoster. There's a place in London named this, and trying to find if there's a connection. I'm not sure if I spelled it correctly. So sometimes, and this is another way that things can get even more confusing, places are named after the people. So the town of Clelland in Lanarkshire, with my own surname, is actually named after the person who owned the land. And so there's the other way around as well. So sometimes you have to approach things in a different way. And if you're lucky enough to be back to the point when surnames are starting to disappear, sort of the 1500s and so on, hopefully you might be able to plug into a pedigree that someone very illustrious or well-to-do has done in the 1800s or something like that, which might give you a helping hand. Don't take them as fact. Always use them as a bit of a starting point, and then start to look for the real records and find evidence. But that might give you a big step forward. Often, if you're looking in London, lots of places in London were named after people who maybe came down there, sought their fortune. Again, looking at the history of different places is really interesting. And in London, there are lots of websites that do this. When we talk about local history, they'll talk to you about the history of streets, places, and little areas. And there are lots of local societies that will do that too.
Yeah.
So exciting. We've got, Pat Allen has said, maybe he was a priest. Paternoster is the first two words of the Lord's Prayer, Our Father. Really good spot there, Pat. That's true, and I should know that. I feel very guilty. But the way that these surnames can appear, there's so many different sort of ways to to create them. So yes, perhaps that's right. Perhaps it came from that particular occupation in that same way. And then maybe there's just a coincidence, and that's why you have to really do the research on paper if you want to be certain that you're tracing the right people. One of my favorite things to do is to research lots of people who have the same name, because I'm not sure which one's mine, and then I start to rule them out. I start to say, well, that one's not the one, and then keep going through.
Because you're not in the right place.
Yes, that one moved away. That one died young, and keep going until I only maybe have one left and say, well, that must be my one. There's so many times in family history, you'll find maybe 3 possible baptisms and say, well, I don't know which one's my ancestor. And that's when you have to use things like local history, cultural history, and then do a little bit of that sort of extra family tree work to work out who's the right person.
I do think you sometimes start getting attached to people when you're researching them as well. And even if you find out you're not related, you still sort of, remember them, and that's somebody else who you've, found and brought on your journey as well. So I feel like it's never time wasted if you get a story about somebody. But
there's someone in these new records that I became a little bit obsessed with. His name was Jules Legendre. He was born in 1785 in Chartres in France, and he was captured in 1810. And he was fought in the Napoleonic Wars, obviously for the French side, and he was part of the Imperial Guard, this sort of really feared regiment that followed Napoleon everywhere and never lost a battle until Waterloo, of course. But when he was captured, we've got these wonderful descriptions of his physical description. So we have his height, his eye colour, his hair colour, wonderful detail. And then we find in the new records he married a local girl. He settled down here. He must have fallen in love with, we can see the beautiful sunset behind us as we go through. He became the French teacher at the high school that's just opposite our building right now, and taught languages until he died in 1840, and he's buried on the other side of this building. So I can't imagine how it must have felt to be taught French from someone who was, one of the most feared soldiers in the world. But that sounds like someone who probably taught well.
Dundee High School has a few sort of historical connections, doesn't it? William Wallace was also a pupil there at one point, so they clearly have quite a fearsome list of ex-pupils and staff.
I mean, that's a long pedigree. That's amazing. I wonder if they have records for that. I think I might have to go knocking.
I don't know if imagine finding William Wallace's school report.
Oh, I wonder. I mean, I'm William Wallace is an interesting character. I don't know all those people that have seen Braveheart, that great documentary starring Mel Gibson. There are other ways to learn a bit more about William Wallace, and there's some fantastic books too. I really recommend delving into history as well. There's a great set of books I've been reading at the moment, The Time Traveller's Guide to Things. There's a Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England, and a Time Traveller's Guide to Restoration England. And it's written sort of like a TripAdvisor.
So this is guide. Like if you woke up and you were in medieval England, this is how you would not get burnt at the stake.
Well, it tells you what people ate, what they dressed, how they greeted each other, what the houses looked like, everything you can think of, as if you were a tourist. So as if you were maybe going to France or Italy, and it says, well, this is what happens usually at this time of the day. This is what the people do. These people tend to work in this way. If you see a marriage, this is what it will sort of happen like. And it gives you that wonderful bit of context. And great.
That sounds brilliant.
They are fantastic. I see Alex has arrived at the airport. This is really fantastic. He's said thank you to the two of us and said it's been an amazing project and a privilege to be a part of. Have a great weekend and check out the photos. They have to be seen to be believed.
Oh, well, that's certainly true.
That's great.
Thanks, Alex.
It's good to see him pitching in from afar, and I kind of imagined him all the way up to taking off to being on his phone and replying to all these wonderful comments. It's been very hard for him to take a day off to rest, because I know he loves you all very dearly and gets really excited by Fridays Live, and he was very excited to do one from Dundee, but unfortunately the flight maybe sort of made it different. But I was partially thinking he might have done it on the move from the coach. I don't think he was brave enough.
I suppose you've got all the problems of Wi-Fi staying as well. You want to know you've got connection.
It is difficult. So we have a little bit of time left. And so just to open up to comments, I know we've had so many. Who has any questions about local history and social history and everything we can think of? While we have someone here who knows all the answers, maybe we can try and find some things out. Any more questions from anyone watching? And we'll happily do our best to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody actually has any specific sort of Dundee history questions as well, you can search for Dundee Libraries Local History and get in touch with us. We've got an email where we're really happy to take more specific inquiries as well. And me and my colleagues will do a bit of digging about our records and get back to you.
Oh, a great comment from Pat Allen. She's recently had the privilege of seeing some of Anne Lister's diaries at the West Yorkshire Archives. That must be fantastic. Do you know much about Anne Lister?
Not really.
Pat, do you want to put in the comments or maybe put a bit of a description of the wonderful story there? Because I think we wouldn't do it justice, but it would be really cool for everyone to hear a little bit more. And Cindy Pennington has said a great thing that she used to start researching in London. She loved those huge BMD index books and the smell and the thump that they made when researchers put them on the table.
That's, I think, for us, it's the giant bound volumes of newspapers and the sort of thump when you, and there's something really satisfying about a big volume, isn't there?
There is. And she said it was great when you heard the quiet yes when people found what they wanted.
Oh.
I might have made a few of those yeses myself. I really like that.
It's a lovely moment when somebody's just clearly loving what they've found.
Yeah. Vicky Seward said, do you know 70 to 80 years ago, if someone had a stillbirth at home, they took to a local church, would births still be registered?
70 to 80 years ago, I think probably, yeah.
There is a register of stillbirths. I know in Scotland. I'm not sure if there is in England and Wales, but that, of course, is a very sensitive subject. So I think it's not online. It's not digitized. So it's something you might have to have a quick look for. It's one of those delicate subjects. It's important to tell the story of everyone in the family and things, and that everyone deserves to be remembered. But yes, I don't think they are indexed or online, so you might have to go old-fashioned or maybe go to one of the sort of archives that may hold that, and I think that may be national, the GRO in the case of England and Wales, and the National Library of Scotland in Scotland. Paul is stuck trying to find his great-grandfather's burial. He killed himself in 1909. So at that point, suicide was illegal. So newspapers would be the first place to look. If you know where he lived, start there. And then perhaps, the areas that he was in when this happened, and start to then work through all these different churchyards. If he committed suicide, then you may be looking in council areas, because some churches wouldn't bury things. We have a very different attitude now, but back then these sort of things meant that you would have to be buried in a civil cemetery. So look at those ones first, and they might be able to help you, but the newspapers are the best place to look. And Fee Howard said the National Archives in Kew used to be a second home. That is fantastic. And Pat has replied, the Anne Lister said there's that TV program called Gentleman Jack that describes it all, and I haven't seen that. I know it's been recommended.
I've not seen that either, but
it's it's quite exciting, especially these I watched the Catherine the Great TV show just recently that's just come on, which had Helen Mirren in, which takes a little bit of a suspension of disbelief, because Helen Mirren is in her 70s, I think.
Okay.
And she was portraying someone in their early 30s. I think it's worth a watch. I don't know if you'd watch it twice, but I like interesting parts of history that perhaps we don't get to look at so much. And she was a very feisty woman who was maligned a lot after her death. A lot of the rumors you might hear about her were made up afterwards by her son, who didn't really like her very much. So you can delve into the real history of that, and that is a fascinating part of history. Strong women in the past really had it tough. It was very hard to
and then
make your way.
I think it's a common problem. The official history is being written by people who don't like you very much. So
it's always, when we look at early history as well, people who have the money write the history, because the people who are writing the history are paid by those people. So you kind of look at things in a bit of context in that sense. If you look at those old pedigrees, I know people can say that I found my ancestors all the way back to to 0 AD and all this sort of thing, and they use these pedigrees that were made in the 800s and 900s, and they were made by kings who paid a monk and said, you go and do my family tree,
Because as a king, you need to have that
Yes.
family tree behind you. It's part of what legitimizes you as a king. So
I've seen
it's
some
very much in their interest to have that.
Yes, and when they did, so if they didn't find anything interesting, the monk wouldn't get paid. So it will be really important to find things, and they'll go away and say, "You'll never guess. You're descended from Thor. You're descended from Aphrodite.
Yeah.
You're descended from Julius Caesar. All of these people are all your
Yes,
ancestors in a
yeah.
nice, neat row." So you might have to again apply that sort of social context and history to that to understand perhaps before you start adding Thor to your family tree and Odin. Who would be a great ancestor, but possibly
I'm gonna go and have to rework some things.
that would be great. So I know we've got sort of a few minutes left. Margaret Grant says, what are the best sites to use? And of course, very biasedly, we would say Findmypast is a fantastic website to use. There are so many records, new records every week. Type in a name and search and see what comes up. If you've got your ancestors, that's great. And you can see, maybe you'll find some wonderful original records. Also, start building a family tree. It's free to build a family tree. See what hints come back. Maybe you'll find the records that you need. And I think we've got sort of just enough time to maybe sort of ask. Here we go. So Leslie Harrison, why would someone who was born and baptised in Ireland appear to have a baptism record exactly the same details in Bishop's Cornwall in Dorset? They were not living in the UK at the time. I think you'd have to perhaps share the examples, because if it's a common name, it may just be a pure chance that these people have exactly the same details, but there may be a story behind it. I think if we could look at it and we knew a bit more about the times and dates, we could do a bit more of that. But I think that's one of those things. I think there's time to give a bit of a plug to all these questions and great things. And I think there was a question earlier about where can I go for some help in finding my past. There's the Findmypast forum, which is attached to this Facebook page. It's wonderful. There's some great helpful people in there. I think there are now thousands. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the last number, but those people are all really willing to pitch in and help each other. They've been sharing their wonderful discoveries. And sometimes it's great to find a pair of eyes in this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great sort of societies around as well. Like in Dundee, we've got the Tay Valley Family History Society, who are amazing at helping people get past knots in their family history trees.
I think that's it. And I think a good sort of final closing comment we've got from Anya, when she first started researching, she got back to the Romans by following hints on other people's tree, and then next day she started working properly with records, and she got to find that it was all nonsense, and she got back to the 18th century.
Oh well, yeah.
I think that's it. It's more important when it's your ancestor, so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for those things. So although these wonderful stories and myths and legends are really cool, they're still inspiring, just the fact that they're people.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't have to be your ancestors. You can still find some wonderful stories. But when you find your own ancestors, there's something even more magical. And when you can prove that, that's great in itself. So I think we're about wrapping up. So do you have any closing comments, Erin?
It's just been really cool to be part of this, and I've loved seeing everybody's comments come up. And yeah, I'm sorry we couldn't sort of get to everybody. But yeah, thanks so much for coming and listening. And I'm going to have to start tuning in on Fridays in the future.
I know I've been watching Alex for a while, and I do enjoy it. And I like seeing all of these wonderful comments and people helping each other out. It's really good too. It's great to see you all here in Dundee. It's nice that you get to travel while sitting in your own home by doing this. But we hope maybe we'll see you again soon. I know I saw you at the start of November. I'm sure we'll have some opportunity to talk again, and maybe Erin, you could come back. We could talk about other things.
That would be really exciting. Yes,
perhaps with more records in the future.
There's a lot to get through in the Dundee area.
Yes, there are, and we'll talk about many other things.
Yeah, we could do more folklore as well. I love a good folk tale. So
that's great. So for everyone who's enjoying these new records, do share all the things that you found. It's going to be really exciting. For everyone else, then just keep looking at those wonderful newspapers, those wonderful extra social and local history things that we've talked about. Maybe that could give you some extra context and colour. Other than that, we'd like to say see you very soon. Hopefully you've had a great time today joining us. You see the sun has well and truly set here, so you've been with us for quite some time. Have a great weekend, and good luck researching your wonderful family tree. Thanks very much.